Welcome to Paranormal Palace Radio, where truth equals reality, and truth is often stranger than fiction.
Hello everyone, welcome to Paranormal Palace Radio. This is your host, Royce the Redneck Radio Man. And if the voice is still cracking a little here and there, kind of overlook it. It's doing better than it was the other day when the rain was so heavy. But it's not 100% back yet. At any rate, tonight I'm going to be talking to Terrence Aym, and he's recently come out with a book entitled Mysteries of the Multiverse. And in it he has some very fascinating things that he covered that really caught my attention before I invited him to the show. For example, the horror that drove a British sailor mad, the amazing truth about an American base on the moon, the astonishing story of America's war against the race of giants, how the genius Nikola Tesla almost destroyed the world, all about a deadly time vortex erupting in Antarctica, why a Russian engineer claims he is a working time machine, Thomas Edison's fantastic attempt to speak with ghosts, the evidence for terrifying giant 5-foot spiders in the Congo, and a Russian spy traveler's eerie encounter with a deadly ghost ship. And as I understand from the bio or the description of it, there's supposed to be 16 more topics, should I say. And there's a couple that he mentioned to me while we were waiting for the show to start that didn't make it to his book before his book went out, that he's put up over at beforeitsnews.com. And I don't have that link handy, but I'll try to get it into the archive for you folks. And if I can, while he's talking, I'll try to get that to you. Real quick, like before we bring him on, I'd like to remind everybody to make sure you share the show with your friends. I'd also like to remind you that the call-in number is 832-632-7904. And if you're on Skype, you can just PM me, and I could take it like I would a phone call with no problem at all. My username's Mr. Paranormal. And one quick plug for some friends of mine that plug me all the time. We kind of do this back and forth, and I don't want to forget later on. And that's to visit my friends at UnitedParanormalInternational.ning. And they got a great social network with a bunch of friendly folks that's always researching this stuff pretty heavily. And they're always looking for more people that's either looking to learn or that actually has the knowledge, has done the research, and would like to share. So, Terrence, let's go ahead and get the show kicked off real quick. Oh, wait, before we do this, one more thing I just remembered that the people are going to probably need to know. Last Saturday, the Saturday before, I missed my guest, Robert Macklin, because I had messed up the time zone, and I rescheduled him, and I'm telling you this now before I forget, because I'm doing the interview with him tomorrow, which usually on Wednesdays I don't have a show. So I want to make sure everybody knows to come back tomorrow night. I'm going to have a show when I normally don't, and it's going to be about the Jesus delusion with Robert Macklin. Okay, Terrence. Now, about you and your book, before we go any further, Terrence, why don't you first tell everybody a little something about yourself and what got you interested in, shall we say, paranormal phenomena?
Well, I'd be happy to. And first, I'd like to thank you very much for bringing me on your show. It's a pleasure to be here. And also say hello to all of your listeners. To answer your question, I first became very interested in all of these topics: paranormal, time travel, alternate universes, ghosts, everything you could think of that is a little bit outside of normal reality at a very early age. About 5 or 6 years old is when it first started capturing my attention. I started looking at things that are within orthodox science, like archaeology and some of the things about dinosaurs, like a lot of young boys do. And that led me to things about UFOs and the mysteries of ghosts and ancient civilizations that people didn't know that much about. And I built on that and was reading a lot by the time I was 7 and 8. And many of the things that I read, although they were not exclusively that, many of them were books that were written about those types of subjects. And then something happened to me. My parents, who liked to travel and who were both educators, had me go along with them when I was 11 years old to Mexico for about 6 weeks. And it was the first time I ever actually traveled outside of the United States, although I'd been to many different states by that time. I'd never been to a foreign country. And one of the places that we visited was the ancient Aztec city of Mesoamerica, Teotihuacan in Mexico.
Oh, wow.
And I actually there. Yeah, I climbed the Pyramid of the Sun, which I don't know if I could do that anymore. I don't know how many thousands of steps there are on it. But I climbed all the way to the top of the Pyramid of the Sun, literally put my hands on the sacrificial altar, of which I saw still dried blood from the sacrificial victims that was actually part of the stone. It was stained with the blood of who knows how many thousands of victims to the sun god. And you know how they sacrificed the victims. They literally took a obsidian knife and cut their living heart out and held it up towards the sun god in the sky while the heart was still beating. So there I was at 11 years old, actually at that altar that had been the sacrifice for so many people, thinking about the ancient civilization there, the strange god that started that civilization, that came from across the sea, that was actually like a Caucasian man with this giant beard long before the Spaniards ever came there, and they called him Cuauhtémoc, and they related him as a snake, but actually the myths were that he was like a human being. So that really got my imagination going, and as I continued to travel later on in life, I went to a lot of sites that are historical, including Ephesus in Turkey, which is the ancient Greek city, all over Istanbul, parts of Europe, strange areas that were in parts of Eurasia, and also some of the sites where there had been massive UFO sightings in the Northwest Territories of Canada, and a lot of other places too. Now, you might say, well, this guy must have gone into archaeology, or he must have gone into some type of field of science. Well, actually I didn't. When I was 12, there was 3 great loves that I had. I loved the arts, which included writing, but also painting and sculpture and all of that. I also was mesmerized by the financial world, particularly the stock market. And the third thing that I was really captured my imagination was the ability to go all over the world and look at all these ancient mysteries and everything. And so I had to make a decision, what was going to be my career? Was it going to be science? Was it going to be the financial world? Or was it going to be the arts? Well, I decided in my own childhood logic that what I would do is I would go into the financial world, make a lot of money there, get out early, and then I could, follow up with the arts and writing and travel all over the world to write about some of my experiences and things in that regards. And at the same time, kept up with science, with Scientific American and other publications, so I could, fuel my interest on science that way, from an arm's length, almost as a person who is outside of science, but still keeping track of what science was doing overall. And so then that brings you up to today, where I left Wall Street a number of years ago and began to seriously write and honed my craft so that as I wrote, I hopefully I got better and better at writing. And I think I do have a natural talent for it. But just because you might have a talent in writing doesn't mean that you can write things that people want to read. So far on the site Helium, which I was really using as my tap board to better my talents, I've written well over 1,000 different articles, and then I also write fiction. And then on Before It's News, I'm one of their top writers there, and have written quite a number of articles, many of which have gone viral, and then have also written for quite a number of other sites, including political sites, and first started writing back in the 1990s financial articles that were published in regular financial magazines. And now I write almost exclusively for the Internet.
Except for when you write a book, which the one you're working on now sounded pretty interesting. Now, while you were talking, I went to your Mysteries of the Multiverse. I had to think a minute on that at beforeitsnews.com, and I pasted that in the chat room for everybody's convenience, as well as your Facebook page over there so that people can find you. And guys, if y'all look below his description there in the show description, you'll find his book linked over to Amazon.com if y'all are interested in clicking over there to purchase the book. And I also wanted to thank you for coming on the show, because I'm always, thankful for, people that have come on and share their books, their stories, their experiences, whatever the case may be, because, well, that's what the show is all about. And without that, you couldn't have a show.
That makes a lot of sense. I might mention to anyone, people, first of all, some of your listeners may have heard of me because I'm becoming fairly well known in certain circles on the Internet. Others may never have heard of me at all. And we're talking about a book, and it's a book that probably no one who's listening to has heard about, which is Mysteries of the Multiverse, and it's 25 true stories from time and space. Now, not every chapter in here is tied into the multiverse. For instance, some of the strange animals that are being tracked down around the world are probably not paranormal, and they're probably not from another universe. They're actually from our universe. But many of the 25 stories do have a tie-in to the multiverse. And we can go into that a little bit later if you'd like. But I wanted to mention that as far as the mechanics of the book are concerned, it's broken into 4 different sections. And the first section is Stranger Than Time, which deals with all different kinds of permutations of time, weird things that have happened in time, anomalies in time, and, as you mentioned at the beginning of the show, a man who actually claims that he's created a rudimentary time machine. And there's physics who believe him. And then the other section, the next one, is called Stranger Than Space. That one has the story you alluded to about the secret American base on the moon, but it also has articles in there about the amazing thing that's happened in the last few years of literally UFO fleets that are circumnavigating the globe. Nothing like that has ever happened before in our history. And then it has other stories about space that are in there, including one about a famous astronaut and a very strange, well-documented paranormal experience that happened right after his death. Very strange. It was first written about by a famous author, Martin Caidin, who, of course, was the person who helped create the $6 Million Man. And he wrote about this, and he himself was amazed and impressed and had no explanation. And I have the story of what happened with one of America's greatest astronauts and the strange things that happened right after his death. Then we have Stranger Than Fiction. And Stranger Than Fiction is a potpourri, if you will, of all different kinds of stories, including the Tesla story and the Edison story that you had alluded to. And finally, the book is wrapped up with Stranger Than Science. Stranger Than Science opens with the terrifying giant 5-foot spiders which have been spotted in the Congo, something I don't think you'd want to find in the corner of your house someday when you walk in. There's also the mysterious monster of the Amazon, which now is so well documented that National Geographic has expressed a strong interest in that. And finally, the amazing story of the legendary ghost camels of the old American West. So it's a book that's a little bit eclectic, lots of different stories, something to please everybody. Many of the chapters, I think, are about things that you've never heard about, or if you have, you've never known the background on it, and this book touches on all of it.
Yeah, I think the only thing on that list that I read that I might have heard about was how the genius Nikola Tesla almost destroyed the world. And, a lot of people think that he was the one that was actually responsible for, what was that, in Serbia or, I'm sure you heard the story. You know what I'm talking about.
Tunguska. Yes,
Tunguska,
it was
yes.
The big explosion in Tunguska in 1908 in Siberia, Russia.
Now, the one that you're writing about, did that have anything to do with that?
Well, that's exactly that. In fact, it goes into the details, what happened before, what happened during it, actual testimony that still existed, the eyewitness testimony of people who lived outside of the area where the explosion, what they saw, what they experienced afterwards, and Tesla's reaction, his curious reaction for the next couple of years after the incident in Siberia, and some cryptic things that he said. All of that's in there. And it does lend some strong credence to the argument that Tesla, with his ability to beam energy, who was testing it at Wardenclyffe and Long Island, his giant laboratory, had an accident, didn't intend to do it, and literally blew away part of the Siberian forest.
accidental doomsday device. That's kind of scary.
Well, later on, he took the basics for that and was trying to sell to the War Department a weapon that he said was so great that it would wipe out whole armies in a flash, and he called it his death ray. And I think what happened is he was able to determine that by accident, when he was trying to do broadcast energy and sent the power through the earth and it came out the other side in Siberia, that he had created a weapon that was absolutely devastating. Now, this was before nuclear weapons, and he thought that it could decimate the army of any country on earth and would make the United States the most powerful country in the world. But the Department of War, for whatever reason, which is now, of course, called the Department of Defense, but in those days it was the Department of War, they didn't buy into it. But I think what the government did buy into was they wanted to get their hands on everything they possibly could that he ever created, even his ideas that he hadn't worked on except just wrote notes about. Because when he died in New York in I believe it was 1943, the FBI swarmed his apartment and took out dozens and dozens and dozens of boxes and files with all of his notes, his schematics, his drawings, his blueprints for everything he had ever worked on. And they took that all away, and nobody ever saw him again.
Yeah, I remember hearing about that, and a lot of people think what it was the people that was going to have the light company didn't want competition from Tesla, in other words. But it could have had, more to it than just that. That could have just been surface.
Well, he demonstrated some amazing things in, I think, in New York in the early 1920s to show how broadcast energy was something that was really viable. He designed and built an electric car, modified it so that it could run on broadcast energy, set up a broadcast energy transmitter, and then proceeded to drive all over New York City on some of the streets, hitting speeds up to 100 miles an hour before he slowed down. And it was all being run by broadcast energy through an electric vehicle that he had.
Oh, wow.
There weren't any batteries or anything else in the car. He was just picking up the energy from the air.
I never heard of the vehicle now. That's interesting. But what I was also
going to... That was one of his inventions. Go ahead.
No, I'm sorry about that. I didn't know you was fixing to speak. Go ahead, but after you get to, I got a question from the chat room.
Oh, okay. Well, ask me the question because I really was actually through.
Okay. Well, I know he's going to say something about his vehicle, but at any rate, it was Jen had asked, when Newt said that if he's president in his second term, he'll make sure that men will live on the moon, does he believe in that statement? And I didn't know Newt said this.
Well, she has part of it right. I follow politics pretty closely. Newt Gingrich was saying that if he was elected president, that he would have us back on the moon with the intention of building a lunar colony by his second term. That's pretty much what Newt Gingrich had said. Actually, all of this to me is a disappointment because anyone who's followed NASA and the space program realizes that right during and after the Nixon administration in the early 70s, the plan was on the drawing board to actually not only develop a colony on the moon in the late 70s, but to actually have a mission to Mars, and that was scheduled for 1984. None of that came to fruition. And it's a shame, because if it had, the technology spun off, which helped to create the miniaturization for computers and everything else that we have now, which has created trillions of dollars of wealth. All of that would have been available decades earlier, including a lot of other technology that we probably don't even still have that we could have had back then, plus any discoveries we made on Mars. And who knows what else we would have discovered once we started really exploring the moon and the Mars. So we've lost all that. I think that we've lost huge opportunities in the 20th century. Some of the opportunities that came to us were from the most unlikely places. For instance, World War II. Nazi Germany created a lot of the technology that we and the Russians grabbed after World War II. They had brilliant engineers, and we built on that for the next 50 years. In fact, Wernher von Braun basically ran NASA for many years. And the Mars mission was his dream. And he didn't live to see it, but he thought it was going to happen by the mid-'80s, and of course it never did.
Okay, and while we're talking about outer space, this is one that I've been dying to approach you with, and that's the amazing truth about an American base on the moon, because there's been a lot of people, including Richard Hoagland, that has talked about moon bases and Mars bases, and really there's no reason to believe that there isn't. I was wondering if you had some information out there that maybe ain't exactly mainstream on that subject.
Well, there's a couple of things that give you strong circumstantial evidence that there is a base on the moon. First, it would be on the far side of the moon. Second, it looked like a base was actually photographed by a Japanese lunar probe that orbited the moon and took a lot of pictures of the backside of the moon. Now, of course, NASA just finished mapping it and released a lot of photos of the back of the moon. But the interesting thing is that the Japanese photos, which were of a certain crater, did not appear in the NASA photos that they just released. And another thing that's not well known is that after Apollo program ended with Apollo 17, within a few years of that, the Defense Intelligence Agency through the Pentagon launched its own military satellite and did extensive mapping of the moon, including taking 50,000 photographs of the backside of the moon. The side that we don't normally see because of the way it rotates, it's the far side, and we only get to see about 60% or so of the moon, and the other 40% we never see because it never faces it, and it's not in the light. So they took all of those photographs, and they never released them to the public. They were all classified top secret. Then the next stage of something that was strange that happened was the space shuttle was developed. And when the space shuttle was developed, the military, vis-a-vis the U.S. Air Force, they wanted to develop their own military version of the shuttle. To that end, they started building a giant launch facility at Vandenberg Air Force Base, which I happened to see with my own eyes. It was at the Space Command Center at Vandenberg, right on the coast of California. And they got to the point where they took the Enterprise, which of course was a mock-up shuttle that was never flown, and they mated that to the tower, and they took some nice pictures of it, and then they took it all down, and then the gantry sat there, and it sat there, and it sat there for years, and they never used it. And finally, after spending who knows how many millions building this state-of-the-art rocket launch facility shuttle gantry, they took it all down. The question is, why?
Yeah, I was about to say, it sounds like a lot of trouble to go to just to dismantle.
Well, I think the reason why was they built it with the intention of using it. As time went on, they determined that they never needed it. And the reason why was, as Hoagland and a few others have mentioned, there was another space program. And it's a space program that's been going on since probably at least about as long as NASA, maybe a little bit earlier or later than NASA, perhaps maybe since the mid-'60s. But a lot of people don't realize that estimates, including estimates by Popular Science, which are probably on the low end, is that since the 1960s till now, somewhere between 20 to 30 trillion dollars, and this is when people weren't even talking about trillions, okay, went into the black programs. A large amount of that went into aerospace. And nobody even knows what was built. Now, some of the programs that came out of there through the Air Force, people are well aware of. The stealth bomber and the stealth fighter and aircraft along those lines. But there's other aircraft, like the Aurora, that there's very strong evidence exists, and even photographs, that the U.S. Air Force talks nothing about. And there's actually 3 to 4 versions of Aurora now. And I happen to hear, this is anecdotal, I understand, but I happened to hear when I lived in California, I lived near a town called Simi Valley, and not that far from there is the Skunk Works for Lockheed, just on the other side of the hills, the foothills. And I was at a barbecue place called the Maverick. And I was at the Maverick having lunch, and there were hardly any people there. It was like a Saturday afternoon, but later, 2:30, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And I was sitting alone at a table, and about 4 tables away from me were 5 guys. And listening to the discussion, I realized that they were all from the Skunk Works. And they were talking they weren't shouting. They were talking in conversational tones, but they probably figured that if anybody could hear them, they probably either weren't listening or they didn't understand what they were talking about. But I understood. And what they were talking about was the aurora. And they were talking about some amazing things with it, how it took 3 states for that plane to turn around, and how the new version was so fast that a pilot couldn't fly it. It had to be automated, because if a pilot was in there, they would have had to be scraped off the inside of the cockpit. That's how many G's it would pull. And can you imagine an aircraft that's going so fast that just to make a 180-degree turn, it crosses 3 states?
That sounds like a pretty huge craft.
Well, here's another fact for you that came out of that discussion that I was lucky enough to overhear. It made a coast-to-coast flight from California to an Air Force base outside of Washington, D.C. in less than 2 hours. But, and here's the kicker, it had to slow down and drop altitude 3 times to refuel. And it still made it coast to coast in less than 2 hours.
Sounds like it's costly to run, though. It burns a lot of fuel, but it'll get you there in a hurry.
Well, there's other crafts that have come, including one that I personally have seen. And I'm not going to go into a lot of details about it, but let me just say that some of the public who's aviation enthusiasts are calling it the TR3 or the TR3B. Many of them think that it's an anti-gravity type platform that's being run by the U.S. I will go so far as to say this. It's especially for any of you out there who are science enthusiasts or who are engineers or have any background in physics. It mimics anti-gravity, but it's not anti-gravity. It's not even officially called the TR3B, but it's fine just to call it that. That's not the actual designation of the craft. But what it is it's a monopole. So if you know anything about electronics, that's like the philosopher's stone, if you will, to physical engineers. It's a dream that they've been looking to find for more than 150 years. When you have a magnet, any kind of magnet, it automatically has 2 poles. It has a north and a south. But if you could develop a magnetic device that only has 1 pole, it only has the south, but no north, or a north and no south, you have a propulsive motor that is right next to Star Trek. And they've been working on that since the 50s. They've thrown a lot of black project money into it, and I believe they've perfected it. So you don't have an anti-gravity device. What you actually have are crafts that are up there that do not have jet engines. They don't have pulse jet engines. They don't have any kind of motive jet engine at all. They're strictly electronic, and they're strictly magnetic, and it's a magnetic monopole. And what it does is it surfs. It rides the magnetic waves of the Earth, and it's actually surfing the sky. And if you've ever seen one, and you can go to YouTube and see some that have been taken by night scopes, and many of the ones that I'm familiar with are perfect V's. They look like right angles, like a carpenter right angle. And they look with the night scope like they have bright lights underneath them. They don't. The lights they're not even lights. They're the magnetic electronic effects that are coming off from the bottom that are circular, and it's extremely dim, but with the night scope, it makes it look bright, like they're bright lights. and these are not flying. They're literally like surfing, like a surfer on a wave. And when they turn, they swivel. They do not bank because they're not aerodynamic. If you're flying a regular plane, and I know because I have a pilot's license, when you make a turn, you have to bank. And the reason why is you're dropping air off from one wing and dropping the air pressure off from the airfoil, so it doesn't have the lift on that one wing as the other one does, and that turns the plane. Okay, well, that's how you make a turn in a normal aircraft, no matter if it's a jet aircraft, a rocket plane, a propeller-driven aircraft. You have to do that. But these don't do that because they're not flying. And what you see with the V, they're not wings. And so that type of technology is probably what's gotten us to the base on the moon. And there's a few other things that are within the article that lend some strong credence to the idea that we do have a base on the moon, and that's why the United States military suddenly became so uninterested in NASA and the space shuttle. I mean, they still use conventional rockets. They still launch military satellites, and they have their own baby version of the shuttle, which is totally automated, which is the X-70B, I think it is, which is basically a spy craft. But they have a lot of other things within, their inventory besides the things the public knows, or even that Jane's aircraft knows about. And some of those may be space capable.
So they got a lot more technology than they're letting on. And of course, if they did let on, then everybody on the world would have it.
Well, back when everybody was looking at the SR-71, when they finally unveiled the SR-71, and they did it prematurely because a model maker called Revell came out with a model of the SR-71 when it was supposed to be a top-secret spy plane. So then they forced their hand, and they had to come out and show it to everybody. Well, then, when the public was all looking at that, they already had the beginnings of the stealth fighter from Lockheed. And Boeing was already working on the stealth bomber, the B-1. But everybody was looking at the SR-71 like, ooh, look at this, look at how advanced this is and everything with these General Electric engines, and the guys had to wear Gemini spacesuits to fly it and all this kind of stuff. Meanwhile, they were building stealth fighters and the stealth bomber, and they were flying that in the late 70s. And then I believe it was 1983. I may be wrong because I'm just doing it from memory, but I think it was 1983 where President Reagan had a press conference and inadvertently talked about the stealth aircraft, and all the reporters are saying, what? What stealth aircraft? And the guys in the Pentagon were slapping their foreheads, saying, oh my God, because it was a top secret in the nation, and unfortunately Ronald Reagan blurted it out, and then everybody within a week or so knew about the stealth fighter. And then a little bit later, the stealth bomber came out, and now they fly them at air shows. Okay, so if you've ever seen firsthand the stealth fighter or the stealth bomber, imagine what they have now. That's technology from the 1970s. You're talking about almost 4 decades later from when they first had those on the drawing boards and on the computers, working out the physics of it, the physics of the aerodynamics.
So right now,
imagine what they have.
Yeah, I was about to say, I bet you right now they probably already have anti-gravity and God only knows who else, or what else should I say.
Well, they might have anti-gravity. That's debatable, and there's really no proof to it. But what I think that there's strong evidence for are the monopole. And you could say, well, that's, has some of the same properties that you would get, the same results from anti-gravity, but anti-gravity is actually much different than a monopole propulsion motor. However, to the untrained person, the layman, if they saw that flying like I have, first of all, a huge number of people, if they saw that in the sky at night, it is stealth. And the only reason I was able to see it personally was because it was dark twilight. Some of the stars were out, but the sky was not completely jet black. And I saw it coming from the south. I was near O'Hare Airport, which is a huge terminal control area, all covered by radar. Nobody picked it up. The controllers obviously didn't see it. This thing flew right through the terminal control area of O'Hare Airport. And I first noticed it because I happened to be looking up at the stars, and I noticed something in the sky that was rippling. Just like you'd see a heat wave on a hot summer day, and looking down the road, you'd see the refraction of the air rippling from the heat. I saw that in the sky, and so that captured my attention. So I immediately looked, what's causing this ripple in the sky? When I looked at it, I saw this perfect V, and underneath were very, very dim, very faint gray discs. There were 3 on each wing. I'll call them wings, but they're not really wings. It was just the makeup of the main part of the V. And it literally flew right over my head, the zenith. I got to look at it directly from underneath it. and then it continued, and then I saw it swivel. It didn't bank. It swiveled. It just pointed its nose in a different direction, and steered itself towards the northwest. It had been going due north, and then it turned towards the northwest. And I saw it when it made the maneuver. It was absolutely silent. If it was a jet black sky, the only way you could have even made it out would be because it would have been occulting the stars. But I was able to see it against the sky because the sky was like a dark charcoal gray, and that thing was jet black. So I could easily make it out. And it wasn't anti-gravity. But I'll tell you one thing, I saw it for about 15 to 20 seconds, and I felt like I was Captain Kirk. I thought I was watching Star Trek technology.
Well, you know, all that there is really very fascinating, though, because you've got to stop and think, how many UFO reports is actually these craft that you're talking about?
Well, I'm sure that a lot of them within the last 20 or 30 years may be some of our own craft that's misinterpreted and thought to be UFOs. And what is a UFO anyway? It's nothing but an unidentified flying object. You could see something whiz past your head, and it was in the air, and it's unidentified, and you could say, oh, I just saw a UFO. And unless you could determine that it was actually a bird, you know, and then you say, oh, that unidentified flying object was a bird, you know. So anything that you can't identify would be unidentified, and anything that's in the sky that's moving is flying, or at least appears to be flying. So a UFO is a pretty general term. Of course, they used to call them flying saucers, but they dropped that because there's so many different configurations. Yes, there's still the classic so-called discs, the flying saucers. Those are still being seen. But then there's also gigantic cylinders, huge cubes, cones, giant pyramid structures, strange-looking type of configurations that you can't even say really look like anything. They're just squiggly. And so they dropped the name flying saucer because it didn't fit all the things that they were seeing, including spheres and everything else. So yeah, I agree with you, though, that there's probably quite a number of people who see either conventional aircraft and mistake it as a UFO. And they'll see things that are within our environment, weather phenomena, and they think that's a UFO because they have no training. Or they'll see some aberration of a normal object, but because of refraction in the atmosphere, it will look strange and unworldly, and so they might report that as a UFO. And then they would see some of our exotic black projects, crafts like I've described, and many people would report that as a UFO. And then finally there'd be the ones that are not of this world, whether they come from another star system, another dimension, another multiverse. They're not ours. And that's what I think most people think of when they think of the definition of a real UFO.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. And I'm going to move this on a little bit because I don't want to forget this next one either. There was a couple on here, like I said earlier, really kind of got my attention. One of them was the one right underneath that, the astonishing story of America's war against the race of giants. And I mean, I'm into, you know, ancient mysteries and ancient religions and ancient aliens. So as you can imagine, that kind of got my attention.
I can imagine it would. What do you know about the giants yourself? Have you got a little bit of background about the giants?
Well, as I understand it, these were actually supposedly the offspring of, well, it depends on who you're talking to. One party will tell you the angels and the human women, and other parties will tell you E.T. and human women. And at any rate, they were definitely, you could say, offspring of otherworldly, and Enoch wrote quite a bit about them that did not make it into the Bible, like in the Book of Giants and, you know, other things. So I could go into this for quite some time, but I don't think I could ever reach the part about America. You're the first one to connect that for me.
Well, actually, giants in the Americas were here and talked about and actually encountered and actually warred against over the period of the last few thousand years. Many of the Plains Indians, and especially the western tribes like the Utes, which later became part of the state called Utah, coming from the name of the Native American tribe, and the Paiutes too, they still talk about the war that they had against the giants. And these were the remnants of the giants. The Aztecs fought against giants and saw giants before the Spaniards came. And the giants were talked about in myth. They made statues of it. They talked about the battles that they had. And for many, many, many hundreds of years after the white man came here and started hearing these stories from some of the different Native American tribes, it was all dismissed as just nothing but myth and legend with no basis. Some of that changed, not with orthodox science, of course, but some of it changed among some of the researchers who were scientists when it came to light that there was a cave called the Lubbock Cave. And this was a cave that was described in the myths of the tribes that lived in what's now known as Utah. And they described the last battle they had with these giants. Now, how big were these giants? I mean, a lot of people in those days were only 4'10", 5 foot, 5'1". They weren't real tall people. So could a giant just be 6'3", and oh my God, that would be a giant to them? No, these truly were giants. The men were anywhere from 9 to 12 feet tall, and the women were an average of 8 to 9 feet tall. So they were shorter by far than the men, but they were still giants by any accord. Here's something strange about them. They all had red hair. They were huge, red-haired, ferocious giants that had their own culture, their own way of doing things, and they wore body armor, a very thick leather body armor when they went into battle. Here's something else that's strange. The Native Americans living in North America, including what's now Mexico and parts of southern Canada, that's the description of the giants that they had. They knew nothing about the fact that in northern China, several thousand years before they met the giants in North America, the same giants existed in northern China. 9 to 12 feet tall, body armor of leather, and red hair. They found mummified giants in northern China, still with red hair on their skulls, and leather body armor, and they found giants in Lubbock Cave, the same ones in Lubbock Cave in Utah, giants with red hair. So it wasn't a legend, it actually is true, and some of these giants were absolutely horrific because what they would do is they would they would kill some of the braves in battle, or even steal children. And according to the Native Americans, and of course the victors can always make the enemy look as horrible as possible, so whether it's true or not, we can only rely on the Native American tales. But what they said the giants did was they would be cannibalistic. They would literally go in and raid American Indian villages from time to time, and then they would steal children and animals too, but especially children. And they would cook and eat the children. And later on, when people were, the Native Americans were looking for, they'd sometimes find the bones of their tribe members.
Wow, that's just, I got to tell you though, aside from the people eating part, I've actually read things that the royal, articles online, that the royal family actually descend from these giants, and that many of them had either blonde or red hair and blue eyes, and that Hitler was looking for these kind of giants. They were originally Aryans, I guess, from their offspring. That was the race they might have started, was the Aryan super race. Who knows how much of that's factual and how much of it is theoretical, though?
Well, I don't think it's theoretical because in 1931, it was published by the Nevada Review Minor, actually in June 19th of 1931, 2 of the giants were unearthed. And it was documented. And one of the skeletons that they found, which both of them, by the way, still had some red hair on their skulls. And one of the skeletons that they found was 8.5 feet tall in life, and the other one was about 10 feet long. And they found that in a dry lake bed that was right next to Lubbock Cave. And so that chapter I have in here about the giants is part of the history of the giants and, where they came from, what the evidence is that they actually existed, and then what some of the stories were that the Native Americans told then and still tell today. I mean, they haven't forgotten the giants. This is part of their history. whether the white man believes them or not, they don't care because they know what happened to their ancestors. And, of course, they're very proud of it because they had a ferocious enemy, and they defeated them. And not only that, but they were probably the invaders because there was whole tribes of ancient humans here, some of them being giants, that still not that much is known. The so-called mound builders were all over the Midwest, including in Illinois and parts of Iowa and Ohio and Kentucky and parts of Tennessee, are the giant mounds of this mysterious civilization that existed thousands of years before what we now call Native Americans came here. And what's really strange about that is they were most of them have been determined to be Caucasian. So, because of the political correctness and the ability to be able to call themselves the first people who came to the Americas and everything, the Native Americans don't like to hear too much about that, and they try to suppress that because actually when they came over the land bridge, there were other people that were living here, and they ended up going to war with them. Like, whenever two civilizations clash, there's usually a war that erupts because they're looking for resources and they want to expand. And so a lot of people don't realize that Native Americans were not native to America, and there's two different kinds of Native Americans. There's the Native Americans who came over the so-called land bridge from Asia through Siberia and the Aleutian Straits when it was not a bunch of islands but actually a land bridge, came down from Alaska. Some of them stayed up in the Northwest Territories in what's now Alaska and became the Inuits or the Eskimos. The rest came down. Some stayed in what's now British Columbia. Others continued further south, fanning out into the northern parts of what's now the United States, going down into the plains, going down into the southwestern parts, becoming the Hopi Indians and other Native American tribes who lived in the Southwest, and then more continued to stream down, and they streamed down all the way down into Mexico and Central America, eventually getting into South America. Because we're talking about over a period after the Ice Age of about 8,000 to 10,000 years. So that was one part of Native Americans. But then there's another part of Native Americans, of which the Mohegan tribe in northeastern part of what's now the United States, they were Europeans. They came here after the Ice Age, making their way probably from Greenland to Iceland to maybe what's now Newfoundland, and worked their way down into where New York area is now and the upper north and eastern part of the United States, and they were Caucasians from Europe. So the so-called red man, as they used to be called 100 years ago by the settlers, were actually Europeans or Asians. And then they fought the giants. And the part in my book is about when they fought the giants, and the giants were real.
Yeah, it's been pretty apparent even in the Bible that the giants were real. I also wanted to ask you another question from my chat room from Jen. And whoops, that's the wrong place. I put it on a document so I wouldn't lose it in chat. She was asking, did he ever read the book called A Journey to the Earth's Interior Bibliography? This is the first I heard of the book.
A Journey to the Earth's Interior Bibliography?
Yeah.
The name of the book? A Journey to the Earth's Interior Bibliography. No, I haven't heard of that book. Of course, I read a long time ago Jules Verne's famous book that he made movies out of it, Journey to the Center of the Earth, which was a fiction book. And, of course, I also am familiar with the stories of the man who said that he went into the center of the Earth, which caused quite a stir for about 130 years, and talked about the inner Earth and the sun that was in the Earth and the race of beings that lived in the Earth, and a lot of that turned out to eventually be fraudulent, but he and his son made a lot out of it and wrote a couple of books about it that were very popular in the 1800s and the early 1900s. But the book that she's alluding to, I'm not familiar with. But I'm not sure that ties into the giants. These giants were basically human. They're like us, but they just were much bigger people. And they had their own culture. And like you said, they may well have come down from the Northlands, the lands that originally created the Vikings. And they may have had some type of tie into the early peoples that later became Vikings who stayed in the north, the so-called Norsemen. But others gravitated down into China, and then others, long before other Asians left China, they left China, maybe while the Ice Age was still going on, and found their way to the western part of what's now the United States, and started settling there. And then thousands of years later, these other Asians come up through the land bridge, and they come in, they think they've discovered a new land, and lo and behold, there's these giants there.
Well, I know that, even if they originated from, say, E.T. mating with the women of the earth, they would have, the Nephilim, they were called, would eventually start their own colony somewhere, so the whole thing would make sense, if you ask me.
Well, it could be. That starts getting into such misty areas and theology and stuff.
Right.
And I think that, there's enough science that we can say this. Did a race of giants actually exist? The answer is yes. There's certainly been reports of them from different regions of the world that go back for thousands of years. We actually have evidence that they existed now. We have bodies. And the bodies that we have, some of them have leather body armor for warfare to protect them. And they had leather shields. And they were giants. They were 8, 9, 10, some of them 11 or 12 feet tall. And it's not a myth. We have actual specimens of their bodies, and what may or may not be myth is the wars that supposedly took place in North America. But you know what? There's probably more truth than myth in those wars, and maybe it's exaggerated a little bit because the Native Americans want to say how brave their ancestors were. But I'll tell you one thing. If all I had was knives and maybe some spears, because I don't even think they had the bow and arrow then, and you were up against a voracious guy who you knew were eating people sometimes, and the guy was 12 feet tall, and he had gigantic swords and huge spears and giant leather armor and shields and long flaming red hair, and probably bellowed like a bull when he ran towards you, and had legs like tree trunks. You had better damn well be a real courageous person to stand up and battle that guy. So I have high praise for these early Native Americans who fought, with hearts of fire against these giants that they were trying to defeat, who were trying to destroy their tribe and even eat some of them. I mean, if you really picture all of this in your mind, it's not only horrendous but also heroic what they stood up against.
Well, the first thing I would think is, feet don't fail me now. But then, too, I'm only human. Well, but then, too, so were they. But at any rate, before we run out of time, I didn't want to miss a chance to ask you about those 2 articles you were telling me about at beforeitsnews.com that you recently added.
Oh, yes. Well, what would you like me to tell you about them?
Well, actually tell the listeners, but, basically what the articles are about and, what kind of key things you might think they'd be interested in. And if you'll share that link directly to the articles tomorrow in email, I'll get them posted over here on my site for other people, and I'll post them in some of my groups and that.
Well, yeah, there's actually quite a number of articles there that your listeners might be interested in, but the 2 that you're talking about, I'll be happy to send you the URLs to them so you can link those for people to go and take a look at them if they have an interest. One of them has had quite a lot of interest and discussion was this fairly well-documented case that happened not that long ago, and to this woman whose name is Lorena Garcia. And the story there, without going into too many of the details, because I don't want to ruin the article for people who have an interest in it, is that she woke up one morning and she noticed that there was something strange about her bed. Most of the things in her apartment that she lived in looked the same. The bedclothes on her bed was wrong. Well, she didn't pay any attention to it. She just thought it was, a slight aberration, and she just ignored it. And so she went about and made breakfast, took a shower, got dressed and everything, and went to work. Well, her car was the same, the streets were the same, everything was the same. So she got to work, a company that she'd been working at for 20 years, by the way. And she no longer worked where she used to work. She still worked at the company, but she worked in a completely different area of the building, reporting to a supervisor that she never even heard of before. By that time, she knew that there was something horribly wrong. One thing led to another. More and more things started being out of whack. Then she found out that a guy that she had broken up with a year before, he was still in her life. They had never broken up. And she had gotten a new boyfriend and had been with him for 6 months. She tried to find out where he was. There was no record of him. He didn't exist. And the man had a son, and his son didn't exist. And by that time, she realized she was in serious trouble. Then she found out that her sister, who had had an operation earlier that year on her arm, her sister said, "That's not true. I never had surgery. There's nothing wrong with my arm." And was more and more and more things. And this documents her whole story, some of it direct quotes by her of what's been happening. And she put a plea out on the Internet to the world, to anyone who understands the multiverse concept, like Dr. Michio Kaku out of New York University, and wants to know, 1, what can be done about this? 2, how did she get trapped here? And 3, is there any possible way that she can return to her real life in this other universe? So that one is The Terrified Woman from Another Universe Wakes Up Here, and I'll send you the link to that. The other one that's created quite a stir and a lot of discussion is the fact that some of the people who are listening may have heard about this. Within the last year and a half or so, some of the world's greatest pyramids have started shooting energy beams into space. The beams have been tracked, and there's a mysterious cloud that's been approaching, which a Russian physicist, the astrophysicist, has been writing about. And for the last 2 years, it's been approaching our solar system as the sun begins to act up. And now it's in our solar system. It's an energy cloud that NASA itself admits is completely unknown. No one's ever seen anything like it. And the energy cloud has now invaded our solar system. And once it was here, some of the world's great pyramids have started shooting off giant spurts of energy directly into space at the cloud. Some of the pyramids that have been doing are the Pyramid of the Moon in Teotihuacan, where I was when I was a kid. The giant Bosnian pyramid. That one, hundreds of witnesses saw this gigantic flash beam go straight up the sky into space. And another one that's been activated is this big pyramid, the Mayan pyramid. There they have photos. Tourists took pictures of this huge beam of energy being projected into space from the apex of the pyramid. And now the Chinese are worried about the Jingping pyramid, which they've been studying for 10 years. And many of the university scientists from Beijing University have become convinced that the Jingping pyramid in northern China is not a human-built pyramid, but is alien. And we're talking about university professors saying this. And now they're watching that pyramid because they're concerned that that pyramid might start shooting off gigantic energy beams into space as well. So I've written all about this. There's not that much information elsewhere on it, but I've tied it all together. And the title on that one is World's Pyramids, Beaming Energy to Mysterious Space Cloud. So I'll send you the link for that one, too, for any of your listeners that might have an interest in looking at it.
Yeah, actually, I was going to ask you about, rather than send me that link to either one of those two, to send me the link to, like the category page that, has the list of all your articles on it, because I was over there and I couldn't find that. If I had that, everybody could access all your articles. You see what I'm saying?
Well, that even makes better sense. That's what I'll do. I'll just send that to you tomorrow, and then they can just go right to that page, and they can find these different articles and see which ones they'd like to take a look at.
Actually, I'd like to take a look at some of them myself.
Well, they can also join my Twitter feed. All the new articles that I have that come out on Helium, other places, and before it's news, I put out in my my Twitter feed, which is Terrence Aym. So it's twitter.com/Terrence Aym, TerrenceAym. They can sign up for that, or they can go to my public page, which you said you're providing a link to, which is Terrence Aym, right on, which is a play on words. It's right, like WRITE on, with an exclamation point, and that's my public page. So they can go to the Twitter feed, and they can go to the public page, and if they go to either one of those, they'll always have my latest articles, and then they can take a look at it and see if they have an interest in reading it or not, And I don't put anything else out on my Twitter feed about I'm going out for a sandwich or I just tied my shoes. I don't put anything out on there except just my my articles.
All right. And I got another question for you. Are you planning on coming out with another book in the near future?
Well, yes, I have actually 2 fiction books that are out in the marketplace right now with 2 different literary agents. And there's been people who've been reading my book that came out the end of November, Mysteries of the Multiverse, that have been pleading with me to write a sequel to it. Because although there's 25 chapters here, it's not a huge book that will take you forever to read. If you're a fast reader, you could probably get through the entire book within an evening. So they love these stories. They told me that they're great, and they would like to have a sequel, so that's up to the publisher.
Okay, well, I know I'd certainly be looking for it. In fact, I was looking around to see what I could find out about it earlier today, and I found a guy named Thomas Weston who has a book out titled Mysteries of the Multiverse and the Mind. Very close to yours, but the inner topic is more about spirituality. But I was like, wow, who would have ever thought I would have found that?
Well, this is Mysteries of the Multiverse. It's tied into the multiverse theory, of which one of the major proponents is Dr. Michio Kaku out of New York University. And he's convinced that it's a theory that is true, and it's mind-boggling because it would account for a lot of what we call paranormal. And the reason why is there could be doorways, rifts, or tears within the multiverses, especially the ones that are close to us. And if everything's vibrating on strings, meaning that everything is basically the quanta, and that everything is either matter or energy, and it's all binary, and you have different vibrations, literally you would have infinite universes that are being infinitely created. And when you're talking about infinities on top of infinities, you literally have anything possible. Anything your mind can come up with probably actually exists in some other universe.
And will in yours one day or another. At
That's
some
right.
point in time or another. Now, also, I was going to mention that we've come up on the 1 hour mark, and I'd usually ask you if you wanted to extend the show, but to be honest with you, ever since the rain come in over the last couple of days, I've been barely walking. I've been having back trouble, so I'm going to go ahead and pull a wrap for this tonight. However, I would love to have you come back in the future, especially when you get your next book out.
Well, my next book will probably be fiction. It may not be a good topic for your show. If I'm going to come out with something that follows in the heels of Mysteries of the Multiverse, it may not be until next year sometime. But if you'd like, I could come back if you want me to. And there's a lot of other things in this book that we could talk about. We've only talked about 2 or 3 of the 25 different things that are in this book.
Right. Yeah, and I noticed that. I mean, it's amazing how, short amount of time an hour can actually be. But yeah.
That's for sure. Well, if you'd like to have me come back, just, either give me a call, and if I'm not here, just leave a message for me, or you can email me, and we'll settle on a time for me to come back. And what we could do, if you'd like, is we could discuss a little bit more about the multiverse, which is the foundation for all of these things in the book, so that people really understand what the multiverse could be, how it would work, how it interrelates to what we would call ghosts, and time travel, and very strange time anomalies, and many different things that really all probably tie in to the multiverse. So when you look out at the sky and you see the universe, and you think that that universe is infinite, and time-space continuum is infinite, it is. But yet there's infinite beyond that infinite. And there's whole other universes that are infinite. And then those are being created constantly, like bubbles upon bubbles, like bubbles upon bubbles, just like Michio Kaku says.
Actually,
like bubbles.
He's another one that I would love to have on my show, but the problem is he's kind of hard to reach.
Well, he's a very popular guy, and he has huge commitments. Plus, he still is a professor. He's an active professor, and he has to have his classes with his students. And he's also in the process of writing different books. And but some of his theories are absolutely mind-boggling. He's on the border edge, almost the fringe edge of science, but he is so well-known and so well-respected that he can get away as a scientist with saying some things that in the past would have ruined some scientists' careers. It's the same with Stephen Hawking. Hawking now is so accepted by orthodox scientists as one of them that he can say the most outrageous things, and they may not agree with him, but they're not going to say anything really.
Well, I think a lot of it is Kaku is being hailed as a genius of the likes of Einstein or even greater, and it's kind of hard to run him into the ground like you would some of the others, in other words. So he can get away with that when others can't because of his reputation.
Well, it is, and people have to understand that when Einstein came along, he didn't supplant Isaac Newton. Einstein added to Newton, and Newton had the mechanical universe, and Einstein had the relativistic universe. And now we're moving beyond Einstein, and that's not going to negate Einstein. It's going to build on Newton and Einstein. And that's how we actually further our knowledge. And a lot of the things that we think are paranormal today, strange occult things today, it's actually science. And we just really don't have a good handle on it yet, that's all.
I agree with you. What Kaku's really doing is showing that even in the present standard models of Newton and Einstein, that there's still room for the paranormal. And it's kind of like pointing out that it's not that it ain't possible, it's just that it's not understood in its entirety. At least that's the impression I get from it.
Well, I think your assessment is correct, and I think that he's correct. And you can point to it in examples of history, and a real easy example would be 400 years ago. People all thought that lightning was paranormal. And they were sure that it was like God, when he'd be angry, would throw these lightning bolts down, and it was paranormal, and no one could explain it. And everybody thought it was mystical, even though they could see the lightning, but no one knew what it was. And then Benjamin Franklin did his famous kite experiment with the key and showed, hey, lightning is electricity. And from that, there was Watt and others who started defining electricity, creating a technology from it. And look what we have today. The entire world's run by electricity. The Internet is. The phone that we're talking on. Everything relies on electricity. And just 400 or 500 years ago, that was considered to be like ghosts.
And just think, if we were robbed of electricity, we wouldn't know how to act.
That's right.
Oh, my God, I'm going to die. I can't make my toast.
If the world came to a stop, like the day the Earth stood still, where electricity was neutralized as the basis of that film, and it was forever shut off, and we had no more electricity, the 7 billion people in this world would be culled down to about 50 to 100 million within 10 years.
Yeah, that's probably
Most of the
true.
world would die off.
Well,
we only are able to survive at these numbers because of our technology.
That is true. No doubt about that in my military mind. I mean, look how small tribes in the Amazon rainforests are. They don't have our technology, but you don't see them growing in the millions in any one area.
No, you don't, because they're limited by their environment. But when we take the environment and shape it to what we want it to be, the more successful we are at that, the more we control our own environment, and the more we can grow. And we're getting to the point now where, like Hawking says, is to continue growing, we're going to have to get out into space in a big way, and not just a little domed lunar colony or something. We're going to actually have to populate Mars. We're going to have to actually see someday, 500-600 years from now, maybe sooner, find ways to terraform Venus and turn it into another Earth. And we're going to start populating those worlds, and then eventually we're going to find ways through the multiverse and maybe jumps through the dimensions, of which are maybe as many as 12, and travel to the stars and have a Star Trek type society, and maybe even travel through the multiverse, like I think some of the UFOs do, which even J. Allen Hynek himself, before his death, he had the theory that these were not interplanetary spaceships. They were not from interstellar civilizations, but they were coming through the multiverse. So he was even ahead of Michio Kaku on that, and that was based on witness testimony and observations of data that he came to that conclusion. And if we do talk again in the future, we could talk a little bit about the meeting I had with Dr. J. Allen Hynek when he was at a university and gave a speech out here before he left for Arizona. I had the pleasure and the honor to actually meet Dr. Hynek shortly before they came out with Close Encounters of the Third Kind, which was based on his best-selling book. And then not that long after that, he left Evanston, Illinois, and moved out to Arizona. And within, I think, 14 or 18 months, unfortunately, he died from a massive stroke or a cerebral hemorrhage. But I had a chance to talk with him, and he told me firsthand that he was convinced that these UFOs, the real ones, were coming from another dimension or another multiverse.
Well, a lot of people are convinced of that. Myself, I think they're coming from, some of them from other planets, some of them from other dimensions, but then again, that's still guesswork on my part. But I was also going to mention to you that you might want to expect an email from me tomorrow. I was going to send you a date in April, because I know I haven't filled that up yet, to come back and talk about this here with Heineken, more about your book and more about the multiverse, because this is a lot of knowledge that I think people could use, and I'm pretty sure a lot of people's going to be interested in it.
Well, I could also, if we have the time when I come back, and I'll be more than happy to come back, I'll make the commitment to you now. You just set up the time and I'll work it into my schedule. The personal experience that I had with what you would call an apparition, which is a ghost, and as you probably know, a ghost is a general term, just like UFOs. And there's many different types of quote-unquote ghosts, okay? There's the so-called doppelgangers, which really aren't ghosts at all. There's the apparitions, which look totally human and alive, and you'd never think there's a ghost until something really weird happens. That's what I saw in Los Angeles. And then there's this classic drifting, spirity ghosts that, go through walls and stuff. And then there's the ghosts that are like recordings. They are recordings. They're recordings imprinted on space-time. Whenever they're seen, they do exactly the same thing all the time, exactly. And so we could talk a little bit about that, because part of that is tied into the quanta and the multiverses. So, we can touch upon some of those subjects, which are really fascinating, and I think we'll shed some light on some of the subjects that the listeners would have an interest in, and perhaps they'd never heard of some of the stuff before, because this is actually the leading edge of research, and it's moving more towards science now, and which is good. Because as long as we just say ooh and ah and oh, look at this, and we got a picture of something, that doesn't create any knowledge. And the only way we're going to further our knowledge about that and actually create new knowledge is to really look at it in a scientific way and be able to find things that we can replicate, duplicate, and then create a technology from.
Yeah, and also I've been working with several people learning more about this too, as Bernard Haish and some other folks like him, and that's the connection between God and the multiverse and quantum mechanics, where, religion meets science, in other words, because I think that's where the ancients used to have their knowledge at. Again, that could be theoretical, but it makes a lot of sense to me.
Well, it makes a lot of sense to me, too, in certain ways. But I'm familiar with some of the work of the gentleman that you're talking about. Here's my idea. I mean, I've never heard anyone else talk about this. Perhaps they have. Maybe I just haven't heard it. But, the current research now for how long human beings in whatever form have been around is 2 to 2.5 million years. When you go back to about at least 1.5 million, maybe even 2, but say 1.5 million to be conservative, 1.5 million years ago, our ancestors were not that different than we are. They really weren't, okay? They may not have been Homo sapiens, but their brain capacity and everything else was pretty close to ours. All right, so fast forward about 500,000 years. Now you're at 1 million years ago. They were pretty darn well like us, all right? Here's the question. How could it have taken 990,000 years where all of a sudden they discover agriculture, and all of a sudden they start getting all this knowledge when they didn't have anything for 990,000 years, presumably, right? Was mankind so stupid that it took 990,000 years before they started creating a culture and civilization and a rudimentary technology and farming and everything else that led to what we have today? Was mankind actually that stupid? Or is the actual answer that we've had multiple high civilizations, possibly 100,000 years ago, possibly before that some huge tragedy occurred and they were wiped out, and after crawling back towards survival, the few remaining survivors, perhaps only a few thousand, it took centuries and centuries, perhaps millennia, before they could even get back to some type of rudimentary existence, living in caves, trying to escape from wild animals, trying to forage in the forest so they didn't starve to death. And they lost all the civilization that they had. And eventually that became just a myth, and eventually the myths were lost. And I think that that's what the truth is. I think that the last great civilization we had was probably about 40 to 45,000 years ago. There's evidence of that is in the Indian writings. There were atomic weapons. There was flying machines, perhaps even some forms of space travel. All of that was lost. Then there might have been a civilization about 100,000 years ago. That was lost in a gigantic world cataclysm, perhaps the beginning of the Ice Ages that went into the full-blown Ice Age between the interglacial periods. And there was probably even a civilization before that. All of that's been rolled into one thing, Plato's Atlantis, which is just a construct, if you will, of the actual super civilizations that existed so far back that we have absolutely no record of them at all, and it's only trace evidence.
And that reminds me, I got a guy coming up soon that claims that Atlantis was in Antarctica, according to his findings. Of course, other people have found it in Bimini, and other people have found it in Indonesia. So we're going to have a talk with this guy. And I just brought it up because you reminded me.
Here's what you could throw at him, because I have a tendency. Now, is there any proof to any of this? Is there proof that Atlantis was in Antarctica? No. There's some proof that some scientists just got to the end of last year that what may have been referred to by Plato as Atlantis is actually off the Spanish coast, okay? Perhaps it wouldn't have been a super civilization. Perhaps that's what Plato was alluding to. But the so-called super civilization of Atlantis, not the one that Plato was referring to, or Lemuria, which was supposed to be the great Pacific civilization, those were placed on Earth only because of the mists of time obscuring everything. Hoagland's come up with a theory, and there's not really proof on it. There's not hard scientific proof, but it's intriguing, and it's possible. If you will, Atlantis was on Mars.
Yeah, I've heard that before. I've heard that evidently they transported to Earth and started Earth as a colony.
Well, that remains to be seen, but I can tell you one thing. If there really are the artifacts on Mars that Richard Hoagland believes there are, and if Cydonia actually exists, that lends huge support to his argument that actually the so-called myth of Atlantis does have a bearing in truth, and it does have a foundation in reality, but it's not on Earth. It was on Mars. So with that, I should probably go, because you told me the show was over 20 minutes ago. We're still talking.
Just one more last detail, and that you said what you just did, if you don't mind. I got to throw this one in there. There's also Richard Hoagland has an article on his site about the moon Hephaestus, and what Cassini's pictures of it. And I probably pronounced that wrong, but he's got a whole 3 or 4 or 5 page article over there describing why he thinks that was a Death Star, much like the one you've seen in Star Wars. And all actuality even has pictures showing how that would look frozen and how much like a Hephaestus it would look. And I was wondering if you'd been onto his site and saw that.
Well, I haven't. Actually, I think that's been up there. It's not a new article. I believe that's been up there for probably about 2 years or so.
I did read it a long time ago. I didn't mean to say new.
I'll tell you what that I think there's more evidence for, and that's the evidence of that was first put forward for the public from Shafyetsky, who is the Russian astrophysicist and co-authored with Carl Sagan, of all people, Intelligent Life in the Universe. And part of that was Shafyetsky's he was real obsessed with this, and he was convinced in his mind it was true. He went to his death believing it was true, that the one of the moons of Mars, which is Phobos, is a gigantic hollow satellite. It's artificial and it's alien. That, I think that there's a lot more proof of that than there is for Richard's idea of that Death Star type moon, which could be true, but we won't really know until we get out there, you know. But I think that the astrophysical evidence that Phobos may well be artificial has a lot to be said about it. In fact, there's many Russian astronomers and astrophysicists even today. They're pretty convinced that Phobos is artificial. That's why they wanted to send up that mission, that grudge mission that they had created. And then, of course, the satellite didn't launch off from Earth orbit, and they lost the whole thing. It was a shame. Not only do you have the possibility of Phobos being a gigantic hollowed-out moon, okay, that might even have been a generation starship between different stars, but there's also that strange, that very strange monolith that's on, and that's been proven by the way, not to be a photographic aberration. It's not a trick of shadows or light. It is definitely a geometric monolith that's standing quite tall off the surface of Phobos, almost like a marker.
And that's the same one.
I think Phobos is.
That's the same one Buzz Aldrin swore was there that everybody was denying.
Well, before he even mentioned that had been known for some time. He was just going back to it because he himself knew that there was something very, very odd about that and very artificial about it. The archaeology of it is strange. And on top of that, it's on top of a moon, on the surface of a moon, that may not even be a natural moon. You know, he didn't go into that because he probably knows about that, but he didn't want to go too far into it because then you start having people laugh at him and maybe calling him a crackpot. But I'll tell you what, that Russian astrophysicist, highly respected, top of his field. He was no crackpot. As far as an astrophysicist was concerned, he was as good as, in every way as Michio Kaku is a physicist today. And I think he was brilliant, and even Carl Sagan didn't argue against that argument that he had. And I'm convinced, unless it can be proven to be wrong, that Phobos is not a natural satellite of Mars. It was put into orbit around Mars. How long ago? Maybe millions of years ago.
Well, I'd definitely like to learn more about that if they could ever. Well, I'm sure they will prove it one day, but that may be like over 100 years down the road. For now, let's go ahead and do a wrap on that one right there. Are there any last-minute thoughts you'd like to share with the listeners?
Yes, I'd only like to say that the universe is much stranger than any of us can imagine, especially when we consider that this is only one universe out of literally infinite universes, and that those universes are being created infinitely. So whatever you think, whatever you believe, whatever you dream is tied in to the multiverse. And the quanta that surrounds us is part of your brain, because you yourself have a mind that operates in the quanta. You affect reality, and reality affects you.
That is true. And I also want to thank everybody for listening. I couldn't have a show without you. Thank you for your questions in the chat room. I'm always looking for y'all's participation. Don't forget, we're going to have a show tomorrow night with a guy that I accidentally missed a couple Saturdays ago, messing up his time zone, Robert Macklin, about the Jesus delusion. And I'll keep you guys posted on the return of Terrence Aym. Terrence, I've had a wonderful time talking to you, and I just told somebody in the chat room, and she agreed that you and me could probably go on and on and on. And I was going to say we may want to set up on a Saturday when we could actually devote a couple hours to it.
Well, we can talk about that. I'll wait for your email tomorrow, and then I'll shoot you the email from the Ford's News so people can go and look at some of my stories if they have an interest.
All righty then. In the meantime, I want to use that as my clue to say good night. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Don't forget to stop by UnitedParanormalInternational.ning. And the show's going to be in our archives, along with the link to his book and the book cover and everything you need to know about him that I have on him, and along with this here show. So don't forget to invite your friends. Terrence, you have a good night. I look forward to having you back on again in April. And I want to thank you for coming and sharing your time and your knowledge with us.
You're quite welcome. It's been a pleasure, and good night to all of your listeners. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.